if Ukraine cannot strike back, which is currently the Biden policy, how do you see Ukraine winning without a major negotiation with Russia?
Before we continue, we invite you to follow our channel, the only American show reporting live from Ukraine every day.
More on the reaction to the killing of the Hamas chief, Sinwar, coming up on our news. I am curious about the reaction in Ukraine. Let's check in with Joseph Lindley now. Joe, there's no equivalent bad guy for Ukraine to take out, is there?
Well, Bob, I think there is. He lives in his headquarters is in the Kremlin.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think in many ways, I think that would be the, at least at a basic level, the equivalent. And so that's why it's such a significant moment for Israel. But what we see is that, even the Kremlin, there are other powers behind Hamas. Everyone knows and talks about Tehran, for example, but Russia has also been one of those powers behind Hamas. And even, as evidenced by just a few weeks after October 7th, leaders of Hamas were meeting in Moscow at the Kremlin. And they've never tried to hide these affiliations. Russia was, in a way, tepid in its condemnations of Hamas, and as I've mentioned, there's, the Israeli Defense Forces have found weapons in Lebanon from Russia, and so while we see Russia, even with its supply problems, working to help those who are opposing Israel, and then we see North Korean troops and more evidence now of North Korean troops training in the far east of Russia, which is an ominous specter here in Europe. And as we there was a President Zelensky's on his tour of the U.S., but there was also another major speech by a Ukrainian in the United Kingdom yesterday. General Valery Zaluzhny, he was the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces for the first almost the first 2 years of the full-scale invasion, and he's now Ukraine's ambassador to the Court of St. James, as they call it, the ambassador to the United Kingdom. And yesterday he spoke at the Chatham House, which is the think tank, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. And he gave the speech in English. His English is not great, but he was able to give the speech in English. And, first it was remarkable to hear, this is a battle-hardened general who, led Ukraine during the, especially that initial year of Russia's full-scale invasion. And he starts his speech, or in his speech, he's quoting, for example, the Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana from the 19th century. A very eloquent and erudite speech. And he said, he started off by saying that he said, I'm not here to criticize the West or NATO. He said, I understood that nobody owes Ukraine anything. He said, even unfortunately, according to the Budapest Memorandum, that document in which Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, he said, no one owes us anything. And he just says, and that's where he quoted George Santayana, who said, those who do not recall their history are doomed to repeat it. He says, I hope at least we can see how this fits into, if we learn our lessons of World War II, what will happen if a free country like Ukraine is not defended. And he made the point, he said, that, the fact that Ukrainians have been willing to bleed, for 2.5 years shows that they desperately want to be free and they want to be part of the West. And he says, that point often does not get enough credit. And then he talked about, as a general, I think, he speaks more freely perhaps than most ambassadors, because he says, politicians, he said, I hope regardless of the politicians' weakness, we will continue the fight and get the victory, not only for Ukraine, but for all of the civilized world. And that's supremely rare, I think, in any case, to hear an ambassador speak of the weakness of politicians. But General Zaluzhny, being a very popular figure in Ukraine and, being someone, who's been there at the front, he was speaking pretty plainly. And he said in 2022, the collective West, and by that he said he meant politicians and the media and the elites, he said no one believed that Ukraine could last. And he said, we proved them wrong. And so it was an interesting, just to sort of hear his raw perspective there. And at the same time, President Zelensky, he's been talking in Europe about his victory plan, this 5-point victory plan. And as I thought more about it, it's interesting because only the first 2 points are what Ukraine needs from the West, membership in NATO and the ability to strike back at Russia. But interestingly, the remaining 3 parts of Zelensky's victory plan are in a way what Ukraine can offer the world. The third point is, saying that we don't have to live in, under the threat of nuclear blackmail if Ukraine can win. The fourth is economic, all the great military innovations happening here, but also all the great resources of Ukraine. And, out of the top 10 uranium producing nations in the world, Russia right now, Russia's one of them. Russia either is allied with or controls in some manner 6 of the 10 top uranium producing nations in the world. The others are Canada, Australia, and Ukraine and Namibia. And so, we can see, Ukraine is, that's another reason why this war is being fought. There's so many resources here, and Zelensky is underscoring that point. And then his last point is, if Ukraine wins and if the Ukrainian army is not bled out, something changes soon, then Ukraine has the most experienced fighting force in the world and on the side of freedom. And this is something that Zelensky underscored in his speech in London yesterday, too. He said, in 2022, people were laughing at him. He was trying to say warfare has changed. We have to focus on robots, and it's not just about the old school ways of fighting a war. And this is what Ukrainians have learned, and that's what I think both Zelensky and Zelensky say Ukraine has to offer to the world right now.
Hard to argue with those points. This is an email from one of our listeners. You'll be interested in this, Joe. Hi, Bob. I'm an avid listener, especially love and appreciate the daily reports of Joe Lindsley from Ukraine. You and WGN should be commended for keeping your listeners informed about the war. I'm opening a pop-up shop in Westtown. We will be celebrating this weekend. Saturday, we will have a bandura player, the Ukrainian national instrument Joe mentioned. Thank you, Bob. With the highest regards, proud first-generation Ukrainian Orisia. And the store, the pop-up is MAK Chicago, M-A-K, and it's at 1716 West Grand Avenue. They're opening tonight. They'll be open Saturday and Sunday. M-A-K, MAK stands for Makers Against Co-op, Makers Artist Co-op, Makers Artist Co-op, and it also means poppy in Ukrainian, a symbol of remembrance and beauty. So they will be offering authentic art, culture, and one-of-a-kind gifts, so you can connect with the cultural heritage of Ukraine. And as you've pointed out so many times, that is a rich, rich heritage, isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, and it's a heritage that they've been trying to, that Russia has been trying to suppress for centuries. And so being able to keep the instruments alive, like the bandura and the songs and stories alive, is fully a part of Ukraine's effort to win here. And, as we, in these sort of heady days in America, as we get toward the election, maybe one thing I can leave you with as we go into the weekend. As I've looked at all the interviews recently, Bob, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and Trump's remarks about Ukraine yesterday at the Al Smith dinner, here are 2 questions I wish people would start asking of each of the candidates. Very briefly, of Kamala Harris, if Ukraine cannot strike back, which is currently the Biden policy, how do you see Ukraine winning without a major negotiation with Russia? That's for Kamala Harris. And then for Donald Trump, I think it's not about methods. For Kamala, it's about methods, but for Trump, it's about the facts of the situation. And I would say, because like yesterday at the Al Smith dinner, he's repeated this refrain he's had lately, that Ukraine is gone. And I would say, ask Donald Trump, can you at least acknowledge, that Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, are still free after 2.5 years? And can you at least acknowledge that Ukrainians believe in freedom so much that they will stand and fight and even die for it? And those are my 2 questions I hope can one day be asked of both of these candidates.
We will stay tuned for answers. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important, that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Что он сказал?
Well, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?